We all have that iconic image of the Viking Age, a smoke-filled longhall and a horn overflowing with mead. But was it truly the nectar of the gods, or is our modern obsession with it telling us more about ourselves than the actual Norse? Today, I'm sitting down with Dr. Simon Trafford to look past these drunken stereotypes and into the real politics of the mead bench. We're exploring how mead evolved from a historical drink into a powerful modern brand, from its ancient rituals to its role in heavy metal, film, TV, computer games, and of course the aspect of drunkenness, which always comes with alcohol. Let's find out if mead is really a history in a bottle, or just a very successful piece of Viking PR. Welcome to Valhalla Conversations podcast, Dr. Simon Trafford.
Thank you, Becky. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really, really excited to be here and to be talking about this. It's great to be on. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Now, for those guests who have been following, or viewers and listeners on my following, have often heard me mention Stavanger. We first met in Stavanger over 2 years ago now, shockingly, for my little academic debut. And somehow I blabbed my way in, and you were all very welcoming and didn't shun me out as the black sheep.
It was very nice to see you there. It was great.
Well, it was really great just to meet you and all the other academics and just like enjoy and relish your passion for your subjects, because it is great. And you gave a really fascinating paper presentation about mead and its evolution as a brand in itself, and the imagery and stereotype of mead, because it's almost like a stereotype as much as horned helmets and shields and longships, and of course grand halls like my virtual one that I'm sitting in here. Without no drinkers, unfortunately. And of course, I guess mead often always gets associated with the horn. I don't suppose you could, I guess, give us maybe insight into where you think the mead stereotype has come from after all these years and your research.
Yes, of course. Thank you. So mead has this notion of mead as being a special historical drink. I think is really quite well established, and there are various reasons for that. There's also mead as a specifically Viking drink, and that's a slightly different thing. So mead as historical, mead as Viking, they're very strongly linked, but you need to look at both of them. And I think what's the case with mead is, firstly, it is just a very, very old drink. So far as we can tell, there is evidence for it going right back in, before the dawn of anything that we can call history, before the writing of history. People were consuming alcohol of various sorts, but there's a very decent chance actually that mead was the very first alcohol of all that humans ever consumed.
Wow.
We don't really know because nobody was writing this down, but it's a lot easier. One of the easiest ways of producing alcohol is basically mixing honey and water and letting it ferment, because you can do that and you will produce, I'm not necessarily saying it will be lovely, but you will produce something that is alcoholic and probably a bit sweet, and that you can then, which will have the effects of alcohol, and that can happen entirely. It may well have happened entirely serendipitously. So there was some honey in a bowl and it got wet. Honey which had been gathered from a beehive or whatever, it got wet, and it was left a few days, and then somebody drank it and thought, wow, this is a strange effect on me. And that's actually, it's easier to produce alcohol in that way than using, for instance, barley to make beer, or even grapes to make wine. Those are slightly more complicated processes that can't happen by accident in quite the same way. Nonetheless, beer making, wine making are both incredibly ancient, possibly not quite as ancient as mead, but it's been around for a very, very long time, since probably the Neolithic. We're talking a long time. But you do sometimes have beer and wine marketed as these sort of ancient, I mean, sometimes they use history to market them. Beer in particular, I suppose sometimes you will see it. So Vikings get used. I mean, in York is an interesting example of the sort of marketing of beer using Vikings. But that's not the main thing. On the whole, beer and wine tend to be marketed just as on their own strength as beer or wine. With mead, there's almost always this sort of you don't drink mead just because it's a nice taste or you're thirsty. There's always a bit of a see me here drinking mead. And there's always a little bit of a performance of history that you drink mead, and by drinking mead, you're saying, see me drink mead. I am evoking a particular past, which could be that you are drinking it out of a great big drinking horn or something like that. There's a sort of performative element to the way that we interact with mead that isn't really there in the way that we drink beer or wine, at least traditionally. That's the way of it. And so and you can see that also coming through in the sorts of traditional places that have sold mead. It has been the sort of thing that you'll get in an English heritage gift shop or a National Trust gift shop or those sorts of places, or you'll get it in the Jorvik Viking Centre or that sort of place. It's not quite the thing that you get in Sainsbury's or Tesco's or just, I mean, nowadays maybe a little bit you would, but it's not sitting on the racks alongside your beers and your wines and your gins and whiskers and so forth. It fills a particular niche, and that niche is all about quaffing medieval drinks in a medieval manner at a medieval feast. It's the sort of thing that will get served to you in reenactment events or in those particular contexts. And so we've got a very strong idea of it as this sort of historical thing. And that I think is interesting, and it's the a sort of an important way that we perceive it. But I think it's worthwhile asking some questions about it, because for a start, I mean, as I say, what beer and wine are also very, very old drinks, but we don't portray them in that sort of way. And that sort of set me thinking about how is it that mead has ended up as this sort of drink? So yeah.
That is a really good introduction, so thank you. It raises so many points that I think many people kind of like don't realize how intrinsically linked, almost symbiotic, the mead has become with the idea of the past. And as you say, it's drunken as an act, as a performance, as part of a celebration. You don't often see it at kind of like parties or barbecues.
No.
Gosh, I mean, do you have any idea of how it's become linked with the horn as a drinking vessel as well? Because I know that's obviously prolific in modern media, such as games, TV, films, comics, kind of thing. And of course, we have the horned helmets. But I've always been curious as to kind of like who decided that Vikings drank from horns.
Well, I mean, they did. Fair
enough then.
Vikings did drink from horns, and a sort of, but also not just Vikings. Sort of there's a horn paraphernalia. There's a drinking paraphernalia. Clearly, drinking in a lot of early medieval cultures, and arguably earlier than early medieval cultures. I mean, there's a good 1,000 years or so of doing this. But I'm an early medievalist, so I'm going to talk about early medieval stuff, which is what I know about. So drinking clearly has a particular, or certain sorts of alcoholic consumption have a particular status in early medieval culture. And that is ritualized and ritually significant and carries a lot of additional meanings. Um, so it's particularly associated in medieval culture with the idea of something called the Mead Hall, which is what you have behind you. It is the sort of the chieftain's hall with tables and with benches where the war band, the comitatus, sit down together and eat and drink and feast. And that ritualized feasting draws them together as a band, and it also cements the relationship between the leader and that band. So, so the local war leader, local chieftain, or right up to the level of the king, is providing food for his warriors, food and drink, and very importantly, drink for their warriors. Doing that in the hall where they sit down together as a group and socialize. And that socializing, that drinking is incredibly important in drawing these people together and turning them into an effective fighting unit, because it's making them it's creating a brotherhood. It's creating a really strong relationship, and also it is saying that I buy your service to me in war by providing you with feasts and good times when we're not at war, and it's all in a sort of celebratory vein that implies that you do have good times. You unite your war band about you. Because of that, because of the importance of this sort of this Mead Hall warrior society, certain aspects of that warrior society then become incredibly important as symbols. And drinking, the paraphernalia of eating and drinking, is clearly really important, especially these horns. And what those horns, and what we see with those horns, is lots and lots of deposition in grave goods, in burials, at the point where you have accompanied burial. Then, so you will frequently see drinking materials, such as these very, very ridiculous, showy, great big horns, appearing in grave goods, showing the sort of ritual significance of this and the relationship between this act of drinking and power relationships and war relationships and social relationships. And so something like something as big and showy as a gilded horn or something like that, it's a very, again, it's really performative, demonstrative. It's a little piece of theatre in its own right, that we all together drink from this horn, perhaps pass it round, again renewing that sort of bond of kinship, of fraternity amongst the war band, and which is why we sort of also see this turning up in ideas like Valhalla, or like Beowulf, these mead halls where you are, where that's those sorts of relationships are being shown to be incredibly important to their society, and also in Valhalla, what you're saying is this is the good society, that the gods live in this idealized warrior society, and the symbol of this is something like the horn. You could also say another thing. I mean, I do wonder, slightly, if part of the appeal of the horn in sort of the modern age is that it plays to all of our stereotypes of what we want
Mm.
our Vikings or our barbarian warriors to be. We want them to be a bit earthy, a bit sort of associated. I mean, what a horn is a bit of an animal when it comes down
Mm.
to it, and it's not just a bit of an animal; it's a bit of a massive, strong, scary animal. If
Mm.
you, as a warrior, are drinking from this bit of a strong, scary animal, then it becomes it's a very strong message about masculinity, about power. It's sending all sorts of interesting messages. But I think we in the modern age very much like the idea of our barbarians being a bit earthy and a bit sort
Mm.
of, yes, they're none of your sort of fancy china cups for them. If they're going to
Mm.
drink out of something, then it's going to be a whacking great horn. Or I mean, it could be the other myth. It could be Vikings drinking out of skulls, but that's a whole different story.
That is.
Talking about leaving it at just horns for the time being, it's because it's part of what we want from our Vikings is them to be doing things like that.
That's really interesting because I kind of like it just shows kind of like how much I fall for all the stereotype and that kind of like I question it but don't quite believe it. Then of course you come out and say, well, they did drink from horns actually. It's just so prolific as the brand image.
Mm.
Because I know fairly recently, one of the Viking museums, and I think it's Denmark or Norway that I follow on Instagram, they put up so many informative reels where they really kind of like go deep in but short bite size. And one of the guys who does it, he was recently talking about how they did actually have glass vessels as well. They didn't always have horns, and
Mm.
that made me think, oh, maybe they had more other things. Like I often think of back to kind of like Coppergate, of course, in York, where they're all working with wood turners and turning plates, and maybe they turned out cups as well,
Mm.
because they would have needed something for the people that couldn't afford the horns or couldn't get into the society, as you say, the Mead Hall environment where the horns were used. And then it also makes me think about the idea of serving, because of course, you know me, my Valkyrie, I'm slightly obsessive. They're always described as serving, kind of like bringing a warrior a cup, not necessarily a horn. But it's of course usually meat. I think there is. I can't remember which animal it is that lives in the roof of Valhalla that always kind of like produces meat from its udders.
It's a goat, Hythrun.
Goat, that was it.
Yes.
Which is an interesting choice of animal for mead, but okay, fair enough.
It's a very, very weird choice of animal, isn't it? That's what on earth is going on there. It's really, really bizarre. Yeah, so there's a goat that lives on the roof, and produces mead from its udders that is then harvested and served up by the Valkyries. What on earth is that about? It's such a, I mean very frequently looking at many elements of Norse mythology, there is a what, why, what on earth is this on about? But yeah, I mean, what an interesting situation. There is a very slight possibility that mead is being somehow associated with milk, but I mean,
Hmm.
it's there's something a bit strange. I mean, obviously, milk itself can be fermented, and you can produce alcohol out from. Yeah, you can.
Doesn't sound appealing.
Uh, but I mean, I don't know what fermented goat's milk would be. This is something an experience I really don't want to
No.
embrace. I have to say, no desire to taste that.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean it's such a very, very curious myth. But there's something quite interesting there about the fact that mead is being produced without the gods going and doing their own
Yeah.
brewing. Well, no, it's their own production of mead. It just has to
Mm.
somehow effectively drip from this goat that's on the roof. It's a very odd myth.
It is. It's all quite surreal because besides kind of like having the goat, I think they've also got a hog or a boar that they can butcher every night and eat, and then it miraculously resurrects, a bit like Thor's goats. Thankfully, though, they don't produce meat. They just pull his chariot. Um, but yeah, they seem to have it. As I say, they tick all the boxes. We've got unlimited mead, unlimited meat, and you can get drunk and kill each other every day, and we revive you every morning, and you can repeat the same thing. Which I guess leads me on to the kind of aspect of drunkenness with alcohol, because like before our talk, I was racking my brain thinking, okay, what myths have I read that involve meat? And of course, there is the goat in Valhalla, but there's also, of course, my favourite myth, the Lay of Thrym, with Thor in a wedding dress going as Freya to Freya's wedding with a with a giant to get his hammer back. Thor being Thor, I think it is like 9 or some kind of number around that area. I think he drinks 9 barrels, and I can't for the life of me remember if the saga literature refers it to it as ale or as mead. Either way, it's an alcohol, but he drinks all these barrels, which I presume are quite big because they're giants. Doesn't act drunk at all, even though he clears off like all the oxen legs and all the fish and even the dainty pastries that were reserved for the women. He eats them as well, which I find absolutely comical. But I don't think there's any myths in which any of the gods get drunk, even when they're all gathered together in Aegir's Hall and Loki comes in and has his spat match with every single one. Some could say that Loki was perhaps drunk and that's why he picked the fight, but we don't see any of the gods show any drunkenness, I don't think.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, we do see in some of the saga literature there are mortals who are drinking and getting very drunk, and that is, and so there is. It's not that nobody drinks sort of drinks to excess and then doesn't get drunk, but I mean, with there's a fantasy there going on with the sort of with people feasting in Valhalla and with the sort of this otherworldly nature of consumption of mead or alcohol or whatever it may be, where it's a very agreeable fantasy, isn't it? You can drink all night and then wake up the next day and feast all night and then suddenly no ill effects, you're able to go and do it all again. No hangovers. In saga literature, people do have hangovers and people do get drunk. There is a bit more of a sort of, once you're at the level of these real human beings, you do actually have to deal with the consequences of drinking a little bit more. But I mean, part of but the sort of idea of masculinity that can take its beer, if you want to put it like that, you can hold your drink. That is a sort of, it's just as much, that idea is just as much present in the Viking world with its complicated ideas of masculinity as it is nowadays. But that ability to sort of drink and keep on drinking, you definitely see saga heroes being portrayed as special or particularly tough and manly because they are able to drink and keep drinking. That's quite a significant and important thing. And I think you do also see that sort of idea of Vikings being able to drink an enormous amount and keep going, and not necessarily then just fall over drunk, as being it enters into modern popular ideas of what's involved in being a Viking, which again are all to do with a sort of ideal of extreme masculinity, and that masculinity that in modern popular culture we want to ascribe to the Vikings, or we want to enjoy in the Vikings, is a masculinity that is very hearty, that enjoys its food and drink, that sort of very much wants to, and it's not necessarily very, very polished. We don't want them to be, we want them to be just, going, and I'm just going to eat the side of a cow and then drink as much as I want. And maybe I will fall down. But the important thing is that you are you are participating. You're being a man in a very unsophisticated, very sort of emphatic sort of way, and in a sense, not participating in that marks you out as not quite manly enough. You're not being a real Viking if you're not able to do that. Somehow you're a bit of a milksop. You're a bit wet, which is an interesting again as a sort of the way that we align certain things, which are masculinity, being a Viking, and being able to hold your drink and eat vast quantities, drink vast quantities, and still get up and operate successfully afterwards. And we've put all of these in a row and said that and equated them in. That's a very popular sort of common idea in popular culture, but again it's something that has to be, that keeps on needing to be interrogated, because of what it's saying about how we have constructed our Vikings to be an other, to be a different sort of identity that allows us to play and think about things that actually aren't acceptable in our society. We don't actually want these crazy, ridiculous, over the top, hyper masculine men who really aren't sophisticated. But it can be enjoyable for a while to play with it, go and sort of read about it, or even act it, perform it. If in a reenactment situation or a cosplay situation or whatever it may be, we enjoy that. We go to the Viking festival, we go and drink loads, we have a fantastic time, and then we put it all back down again, and we go back to normal society and behaving in a relatively civilized way, and not drinking or everything that there is, not eating everything that there is. But it's that ability to play with these ideas of masculinity, and of what we want the Vikings to be, is really important in the way that have constructed for ourselves a notion of Vikingdom connected with alcohol. Sure, it's based on what we're getting out of the sagas or mythology. It's all there, and we've got the tools, but we have used those tools to create a particular impression, which is all to do with a sort of notion of masculinity that is simultaneously quite attractive to modern society, but also wholly unacceptable to modern society.
Yeah, it's certainly putting it in a fresh light with the way you've presented that remarkable insight and that critique of why we think this, and the fact that, as we've been discussing, kind of like Mead's often associated, if not with the gods, it's certainly kind of like with the higher echelons of Viking Age society. Kind of like you wouldn't find the common folk like the fisher people, the people who sailed and fished, or the weaver's wife making all the sails, or the carpenters. They wouldn't necessarily have access to Mead, because it's made me remember a very long time ago, back in one of my many trips around the Jorvik Viking Centre on their little amazing time travel ride through their Viking Age street of Coppergate. And you get near to where the river is, and you see two guys filleting eels, of all things, amongst fish. And it mentions, either audibly or on the screen, that kind of like they knew the river water was not healthy to drink, so they drank watered down ale instead. And I thought, well, of course, there would have been other drinks besides mead, that were either cheaper to get or cheaper to make, or they were kind of like easily imported and shared around. It's something that you don't often hear about, is kind of like Vikings brewing, whether it's in Scandinavia or in what eventually became Anglo-Saxon to then unified England, so to speak. You don't often hear that aspect of how these drinks were made, whether it's mead or ale or beer or any other type of alcohol. Because of course mead has a lot of honey in it, doesn't it?
It does,
So they would
yes.
have had to have beehives or knew where beehives were to then try and get the honey, a bit like Pooh Bear, maybe, if they didn't actually kind of like have a more closer relationship, I suppose, like beekeepers do today.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting because particularly given the way that that uh, the Vikings in particular of all early medieval peoples have, at least for the last 30 or 40 years, they have been the ones who tended to be very strongly associated with mead in cultural productions of all sorts, of their sort of film, TV, etc., etc., etc. But actually, producing mead in Scandinavia is hard because it involves gathering honey. I mean, bees do produce. There are honeybees in Scandinavia, or at least in bits of Scandinavia. But for the most part, the mead that was being that to the extent that we see mead being consumed in Scandinavia, it's actually being produced elsewhere, or the honey is being produced elsewhere. For instance, I mean, possibly in England, possibly around the Baltic, particularly the southern Baltic. It's far more abundant in sort of what's now Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, rather than in Scandinavia. So, in terms of the drinks that are being consumed, there are various drinks that we see being talked about. So, in England, it's there's Beor, Ealu, Medu, and Win, and those are our sort of obvious Old English terms for the various drinks that are being consumed. Beor is slightly confusingly perhaps not necessarily beer. Beor may well actually be something like cider. It looks as though in the early Middle Ages, this term Beor, which clearly is the etymological root of our word beer, but in our earlier sources, it looks as though it's fruit based. It looks as though it's cider. You can't say definitively because it's because the evidence just is not strong enough. Ealu is ale, but it's not hopped ale. It's a barley-based alcohol with various what are called botanicals. It's got various flavorings in, but hops don't really come in, which are the sort of a real characteristic of our modern beer. They may sometimes be present, but they're not. It's beer as being malted barley flavored with hops. That's rather later. That's 13th, 14th century. That drives out all other types of barley alcohol. Then there's Medu, which is almost certainly mead, and there's Win, which is of course wine. But there's a sort of there's a hierarchy of these drinks, which really comes through in the language that is used to describe them. Christine Fell looked at this a very long time ago, about 50 years ago. There's a very good article by Christine Fell from 1975, which looks at these different words for different sorts of drink, and looks at the context in which they appear, and also the way that they are that they're used to form compound words. And what Fell noticed was that in more sort of workaday sorts of sources, in charters and that sort of thing, things which are actually practical historical sources about real people, the drinks which tend to get mentioned are Beor and Ealu. They're these sort of lower status, sort of they're I mean, not I mean, which is not to say that beer and cider and beer and ale are not being drunk in your high status places as well. But the sort of the ones that are, but they're the ones that tend to get mentioned. So, for instance, they'll crop up as part of the rent that people have to pay will be expressed in terms of an amount of ealu. Whereas Mead turns up in poetry, and it turns up in, and it also tends to turn up in terms of the compound words. It turns up in words which like meadu seld or meadu hala. It's turning up in sort of emotive contexts which are to do with the relation with the workings of a good society, as I was sort of talking about earlier. That Mead is it's not really appearing in this sort of workaday sort of way. It's appearing in poetry. It's all about an idea of the ideal, of the sort of a slightly otherworldly sort of place. The fact that mead is what they drink in Valhalla is another aspect of this. This is all about the perfect idealized warrior society and the top end of that society, which is surely to do with the fact that it's a lot easier to produce once you get going with alcoholic production. You can grow barley abundantly in all sorts of places. Finding honey is a lot harder, and is a lot harder to sustain on a sort of really. You're tending to rely upon bees who are less reliable than barley. So you get a notion of a sort of, in our sources, Mead is a bit otherworldly and a bit sort of also what Christine Fell was arguing was that in something like Beowulf, it sort of has a feeling of being the past, that it's sort of it can be present in our society, where by our I mean the Beowulf writer at the end of the 10th, early 11th century, probably. Let's not. That's a can of worms. So, but they're looking back to a sort of slightly golden age, a sort of this is how society should be, and part of how society should be is everybody drinking mead. That's not necessarily a picture of how things actually happen in real life. And you get a really interesting other example of this in a text. There's a text inserted into King Alfred's Old English version of Erosius's Historiae Adversus Paganos, which is a text of somebody called Wulfstan of Hedeby in southern Denmark, so Danish German borders, which describes a visit to the Este, which is probably, I mean, could be Estonia or could be the Prussians. It's somewhere in the southern eastern Baltic, and there's a statement there which says that that no ale is brewed among the Este because there's so much mead. And he also says in that text that the king and the most powerful men drink mare's milk, and the poor men and the slaves drink mead. The only reason that you would put that in is because it's the direct opposite of what's happening in England.
Wow.
It's saying, look at these weirdos over there in the East, who completely invert society. So there's so much mead there that it's what the poor drink and it's what slaves drink.
Mm.
And the only reason that you're doing that is because mead itself in Anglo-Saxon society, probably in Scandinavian society, is this incredibly high status drink, which you talk about because it is sort of idealized. It's like I think it's a bit like these stories are a bit sort of like James Bond, the sort
Mm.
of drinking martinis shaken not stirred.
Mm.
That's not how people actually behave, and it's a sort of idealized masculine fantasy of how you want to be. So the
Mm.
fact that we do have mead turns up in our sources, sure, a lot. And because of that, we've sort of got this idea of because it's there in the idea of
Mm.
what Valhalla is, because it's there in the Beowulf story, we've got this idea that therefore that's what the Anglo-Saxons drank, that's what the Vikings drank. No, it isn't. I mean, any more than everybody who in our society with James Bond films, we're not going around drinking martinis shaken not stirred all the time.
Mm.
It's a poetic ideal. It's a sort of ideal of how things would be if you got to be James Bond, if you got to live that
Mm.
sort of idealized life of how things are. The very last thing that, sorry, I've rattled on for ages. Last
No
thing that I want
worries,
to
go
say
for
about
it.
is that what's really interesting is that sure, mead is a high status drink and is sort of is this slightly exotic something that you want to drink but probably don't have the opportunity to most of the time. But right at the very top of society, Othin drinks wine.
Really?
So the king figure is drinking the most exotic drink of all, which is wine. And wine carries all sorts of associations. It's certainly in Scandinavia, mostly in England, it's an import. But not only
Mm.
is it an import, but it's an import that carries all sorts of additional meanings because
Mm.
of where it comes from, because it comes from the Mediterranean, because it's what the Romans drank. It's perhaps also, I mean, may have a certain Christian associations as well. But it's this incredible exotic. Who drinks that? That's completely unattainable. But that's what the absolute pinnacle of society drinks is wine. Slightly later, sort of in England, from the post Norman conquest period onwards,
Mhm.
um, wine becomes really enshrined as the very, very high status drink. And
Mm.
if you are performing your status by the way that you consume things, which is a very good way to perform status,
Mhm.
then you perform your status by drinking wine, not by drinking mead. So it may be, and this is not definite, but what seems to be happening from sort of maybe 1100, 1200 onwards is that mead gets squeezed out because at the very top of society you do have access to wine, and that's the desirable drink to be seen to be drinking.
Mm.
At the bottom of society, people continue drinking uh, ale, beer, increasingly sort of from the later on 13th, 14th century, it becomes hopped beer. Now, the real beauty of hopped beer is that hops are, amongst other things, a preservative. And
Ah.
what that allows, prior to the sort of uh, hopped beer becoming available, beer almost certainly is brewed domestically, probably by women in the home.
Mm.
So it's being produced at sort of as you need it in the home. What hopped beer allows you to do is to keep it for longer periods, and that allows you to concentrate it into industrial production. And that means that
Mm.
what you can do is you start having manufacturers who are creating a lot of it and then are sending it out and selling it, rather than what you have had previously, which is people just brewing beer as and when they or ale
Mm.
as and when they need to, and that interestingly also that probably concentrates the industry in the hands of men rather than of women.
Mm.
There's quite a Judith Bennett wrote quite interestingly about the way that this happens, and that control of brewing moves from the hands of women into the hands of men in the sort of 13th, 14th century. Um, but the what that means practically for mead is that you are having this cheap industrial production of enormous quantities of ale slash beer, which squeezes it right out at the bottom end, and
Mm.
at the top end of the market, it's squeezed out by wine. And it could
Mm.
be, it seems to be, that that's why mead sort of disappears, at least in Western Europe, as a drink of anybody other than occasional farmers and beekeepers. And certainly
Mm.
by the 18th, 19th centuries, mead is this weird. It's a drink from the past,
Mhm.
and it becomes, which is part of why we tend to think of it in that way, as this sort of, it doesn't have a presence in our everyday culture in a way that beer and wine do. And coming back to sort of that question that I was asking, why is it that wine, beer, and mead are all really old? But
Mm.
the one that we think of as old is mead. And I would argue that that's because wine and beer just keep on going. And so
Mm.
we don't have to put them in that sort of envelope of old. Wine
Yeah.
and beer are just, they've always been present. So we think of them as that's just what people drink. That's your alcohols. Whereas mead had got vanished into this sort of weird Neverland where there isn't an everyday presence to it, and that's why
Mm.
we think of it as this drink from the past, and we associate it. And this becomes really important where at the sort of in the 19th century, 18th, 19th, 20th century, when we start to rediscover Norse mythology, and it becomes this romanticized idea of what
Mm.
early Europe is all about, and we see mead appearing in Beowulf, in
Mhm.
Valhalla, in Snorri, in the Edda literature. It's and it's there, and it's so that becomes a, for that reason we see this slightly odd drink that we don't have on our
Mm.
supermarket shelves as being this weird, slightly odd drink from the past, which is why then when, I don't know, reenactment takes off, or in America, Renaissance fairs
Mm.
take off. If you want to symbolize what you are doing by going to those feasts, or indulging in that sort of medievalism of those contexts, any of these Viking festivals that you may talk about, um, mead is the obvious drink of choice because it has these connotations. It feels old, it feels
Mm.
appropriate, and when we want to feel as though we're entering into an other that isn't our boring, normal, everyday lives, what we do go and
Mm.
do is drink mead.
That is really illuminating and enlightening, and it, especially as you say, kind of like the import of wine and how much that says kind of like, yes, mead is linked to the gods, and kind of like as a great kind of like great king or a great jarl who has brings out barrels of the stuff. But to import wine, it shows you had those network connections and the money to afford to have that connection going all the way back. Because of course wine was probably transported around the Mediterranean for many decades, if not centuries, before kind of like we fully established that trading network. I mean, I know we've been trading with the Mediterranean since the Iron Age.
Yeah.
Like we've got Iron Age, like often oil vessels connecting with like those conical jars that would have like handles. I never know how they stand up, but they must have made props for them all. But yes, because I guess it just shows that even back then, the kind of like the effect of supply and demand, the fact that Mead, as you say, was so tricky to make because you've got to have the local knowledge of where the honey is without scaring off the beehive entirely, and then you have to find another beehive. Because of course, I don't know how they had beekeepers, if they had beekeepers back then, and how they managed their bees.
Yeah, no, they did have beekeepers. There's actually one of the bizarre things is that of all of the Scandinavian world, our best evidence for beekeeping is from the Coppergate excavation in
Really?
York. Yeah,
Oh wow!
there is a dead bee layer in Coppergate where clearly there has been beekeeping going on. But there is beekeeping in things called skeps, which are sort of which are kind of constructions a bit like a modern hive, but they're not as efficient, and possibly you actually have to kill all of the bees in order to get the honey out of them. They're not like the sort
Yeah.
of into the things that you can slide honey slides of honeycomb out of in modern hives. So there is evidence for beekeeping, but not in Scandinavia. There is evidence for beekeeping in the Scandinavian world more broadly in the Viking Age, but in England.
Wow.
What there also is a sort of, again, in the Baltic area, in the Eastern Baltic, is tree beekeeping, which is basically is where you are you keep bees effectively in hollowed out trees or in trees. What you need to do for that is to you need trees. You need a very dense forestation, which you have in Poland, in Estonia, in Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, those sorts of areas, in a way that you don't have in the West. And you need a fairly thin population, because keeping bees is a slightly antisocial thing to do. It's not necessarily what you want in very heavily populated areas. So we don't know quite how the neighbours of the Coppergate beekeeper reacted to the fact that there were bees all over the place. But really interestingly, what this meant that the Baltic area seems to have sustained a much higher degree of bee production, honey production, but also beeswax production. So it may be so. From the sort of conversion of Western Europe, Northern Europe, Western Europe, it becomes necessary to have beeswax, because for all sorts of reasons, amongst other things, for candles. You need to have candles for all sorts of reasons. But it may be that honey production is a side product of beeswax production. But you have a sort of where in Western Europe mead production seems to sort of dwindle and die out from maybe 13th, 14th, 15th century. It's still there, but it's just not all that important. In Eastern Europe, and particularly around the Baltic, mead never goes away in the same way that it did in Western Europe. Which is also really interesting, because I did a little bit of work on this, looking at the way that that mead is marketed in various countries around the world, and in the West, in Britain, in Scandinavia, mead is sometimes it's sort of really sort of marketed on the basis of its historical associations. Sometimes it isn't. When it is marketed on the basis of its historical associations, it tends to be Vikings. It tends to be. Even in Brazil, even in Argentina, mead makers will have the sort of the runic lettering and the possibly very fake horned helmets and all of that sort of nonsense. It even in these places that, which is to do with the way that the Vikings are a sort of piece of global culture, global popular culture, and so you pin your mead onto the Vikings, even if you're in Brazil or Spain or who knows where.
Yes.
In Poland, it's never associated with the Vikings. In
Really?
Estonia, no, it's not at all. It's always it's always the sort of the local town will be named, and the mead will be named after its locality. So you don't name it after, it doesn't have that sort of historical association, because mead never went away in Eastern Europe. It was just a normal drink. It was just something that people made, and so it's always about local associations. It's not about this sort of historical idea of it, which is the immediate association that we have with it in the West.
That is fascinating, because like even a couple of months back, I was shopping in Morrison's, as I will be shortly after this recording, for the family to keep the household full, and I came across an energy drink, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was called Viking Berries, and it had a very stereotypical Viking imagery on horned helmets, swords. There were skulls, but they also had horned helmets on. So I'm like, are you saying you've killed Vikings in this scene? I'm not sure what's going on. But yes, because Vikings is such, as you say, such a brand, and it is so global, so international. I mean, the fact that I've somehow got my way into an international congress on the reception of Valkyries, which is being hosted entirely by Spain, just shows how far this stretches. But gosh, that it makes you really kind of like realize why mead has this effect, this imagery, this presence in our mind as being that luxury drink, because it was tricky to make. It wasn't always available, whereas if you've got the money, you could afford the wine, and of course there were other drinks such as ale and beer and that kind of thing. Because I don't know, has even historically or even modern wise, kind of like, well, you mentioned Brazil obviously has and does make their own modern mead, but kind of like, whereas mead never really made the reverse trip as wine does to the Mediterranean, kind of like up to the north. Mead never got imported all the way to the south. It was just not seen as, I suppose, not seen as that kind of a drink, even by the Mediterraneans.
Well, no, that's not quite. I mean, definitely both the Greeks and the Romans had honey alcohol, and come to that, as did India, at an early stage. Almost certainly had alcohol based on honey. It's so it is there in say the Mediterranean area, and so we have things like ambrosia, which may or may not be mead. It's hard to tell, but to the extent that we can see it may be. So it was there, but it lost in the Mediterranean. It did lose out to a certain extent to wine, as it never had the sort of status connotations that it seems to have done in Northern Europe, because wine was in the Mediterranean area, was relatively easy to produce and was seen as a preferable alternative for whatever reason. I mean, it's hard to know exactly why. So it is there, and it's also there. I mean, honey alcohol. It's there in Ethiopia actually. There's a drink. I'm probably going to mangle the pronunciation of this. It's spelled Tej, which I want to pronounce as Tej, but I've no idea how it's actually supposed to be pronounced. So please please don't write in, or please do write in and tell me how to pronounce it. But there is a certain tradition of African production of a honey alcohol. Possibly there are even hints of it in South America as well, before European colonization. Possibly, hard to tell, hard to be certain about that. So it is there in the rest of the world, but it's but the Mead carried on the back of the sort of worldwide branding of the Vikings as a sort of popular cultural idea, has trodden all over that. So even there used to be it's shut, but there used to be a Viking themed mead bar effectively in Shanghai.
Really?
Which is amazing. If you want a wonderful example of just how odd popular culture can be, then that is that's it. But I mean, in Spanish speaking countries, it's honey alcohol is called hydromel or hydromiel, or there are various sort of words for it. But you will very frequently see it being called mead, just because it has all of those associations with the Vikings, and that's due to the Vikings as popular cultural staple from constant use in the 20th century, from all of the films, all of the TV programs, all of the comics, all of Marvel, you name it, all of these different things. It's such a staple, and it's become so associated with the Vikings, but also to an extent also with Beowulf. But people are never quite sure what to do with Beowulf, because it's an Anglo-Saxon poem, but it's set in Scandinavia, it's set in Denmark, probably, or southern Sweden, probably. And so Beowulf, although it's English, it's sort of Viking, and it feels like it gets tied into a sort of overwhelming Vikingness. And it's a lot, and Vikings have got a far stronger identity than Anglo-Saxons have. They've got a much stronger popular identity and modern popular culture than Anglo-Saxon have. Therefore, Beowulf, despite the fact it's English, despite the fact it's Anglo-Saxon, gets somehow lodged. It gets popped into that Viking box, and we're perfectly happy to see it there, in a sort of generic early medieval barbarian that we're going to put the V word on. So, but because of that, that branding has carried Mead out worldwide as this thing which is a bit Viking. And so even in these countries, I mean, I don't think this is the case in Ethiopia, or at least I don't think I don't have very much evidence on that. But certainly in, say, your Spanish speaking, your Portuguese speaking bits of the world, Mead somehow manages to have that Viking association, even though there are independent traditions of production in these countries that have nothing to do with the Vikings and are their own. They don't even have the same word, except that sometimes in these modern productions, yes, they import that word, and it becomes the sort of thing that is sold to reenactors. It is sold to people who are trying to capture a sort of a bit of that Viking glamour, and and that's always important. That sort of historical association is always what we make with mead, and it tends nowadays to be with Vikings.
I think we could kind of carry on for hours because it's making me think back to the Assassin's Creed Valhalla game where they regularly pop up with a drinking competition as kind of like a game within the game. And for the life of me, I can't remember. Is it a flag barrel of mead or is it a barrel of ale they keep making you? I can never succeed in those.
I'm pretty certain it's mead, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you also get that in thingy. God, another Viking themed game, the name of which is just completely escaping me at the moment. With the Nords in I can't think of this game. This is really annoying. But you do see, but mead crops up in computer games, and in association with Vikings, and it's portrayed as the natural drink of Vikings. You will also see it sort of appearing in the various sort of Viking lifestyle sites that there are on the web. You will see that the thing that the drink that you see appearing is mead. There are lots and lots of people out there who will sell you drinking horns, and what they will, and there are loads. They say that the first thing that you do on getting into reenactment is go and buy your horn, and that this is the almost the well, before you buy your sword or your whatever clothes that you're going to wear, the horn is one of the sort of fundamental things. But alongside the horn, if you go to these various sites out there that there are, you will see that the another thing that will be sold to you is mead. Equally, if you go to the Viking market at Jorvik Viking Festival or Hisham Viking Festival or Largs or any of the one outside the Valhalla Viking Festival outside Basingstoke, any of these Viking Festival or Hoos, you will find that that what is being sold to you is mead. That association is just so very strong. Even one nice little interesting little thing that I find is also the same manufacturer can be making meads that they bottle in a Viking sort of way and in a healthy sort of way. There's a sort of hipster idea of mead as and a way that mead is sometimes marketed as being this sort of natural artisan alternative to mass-produced sort of drinks, and there they are very much emphasizing bees. It's a lovely natural product. It's made using basically water, honey, and yeast, and there is nothing more to it than that. It doesn't have nasty preservatives in. It's none of this sort of stuff. And you will see marketing along these lines when they take their product, when a manufacturer takes their products to a kind of foodie sort of fair or that sort of thing.
You often see them at food festivals, definitely.
You will see it being marketed in that sort of way. And you will see, but then you will also see sometimes the same manufacturer with approximately the same product will stick it in a bottle which has got ravens and axes and longships and all of that sort of paraphernalia, and they'll take it to the Viking festivals, and it's in bottles which are plastered with all of this sort of stuff, but it's the same stuff. It's the same inside the bottle. You've got this drink which is being marketed in one way to one audience and being marketed in another way to another audience, and that there has been, particularly since the sort of turn of the 21st century, there has been a huge boom in mead, just as a drink, which is being portrayed as this sort of healthy alternative sort of drink, and is being marketed effectively as a sort of healthy, natural alcopop, which is
Mm.
a very, very different sort of connection from the very traditional way that mead has been portrayed as this sort of reenactors drink, and
Mm.
very sort of playing upon its history. And I think that's to do with people who really do want to uh, move mead out from this very niche market of
Mm.
selling to reenactors, selling to people who are basically drinking it for the historical sense,
Mhm.
into what is potentially a much, much bigger market of being a sort of a drink which is being sold on its own merits, on the sense
Mm.
of it as healthy, natural, all of these slightly hipsterish sorts of things,
Mm.
artisanal, as and being sold in those sorts of ways. I don't know if that's quite succeeded. Um,
Mm.
it isn't. Mead is not on the shelves at Tesco's or Sainsbury's or Aldi or Morrison's or you name it. I mean, you might be able to get one bottle if you go to a really big supermarket, but
Mm.
it's not there in quite the same way. So there has been a big push to try to make it this sort of more normal drink and
Mm.
shed the historical associations, partly because they almost want to shift it into being something trendy. They want to shift it
Mm.
into a potentially bigger market, and away from all of that. But at the
Yeah.
same time, you've got that very, very solid. You can
Mhm.
rely on selling, I don't know, 100,000 bottles of mead by being appealing to the people that you get going to the Jorvik Viking Festival, or these sort of particular associations. I think manufacturers have their eye, have think are perfectly happy to sell 100,000 bottles of mead to those people, but they have their eye on the millions or tens of millions of bottles of mead
Mm.
that they would like to sell to a much bigger market, that is the beer market, that is the
Mm.
alcohol market. And they're trying to shift mead, trying to shift the identity of mead into something that is a bit broader and a bit wider. Whether they're successful in that, I think the jury's out on that, and
Mm.
I don't know. But it's an interesting development, because because it moves mead from this image that it has always had in Western Europe, in America, of this sort of Renaissance fair, Jorvik Viking festivals, wherever they may be,
Mhm.
and shift it into another place. And it's we let's see whether that actually happens.
Yeah, I'll certainly keep an eye out next time I do my food shop. I do have a flashback memory of seeing at the end of an aisle a row of mead bottles in my mum's local Morrison's when I was staying with her for a weekend. But it was pretty much all Viking branded.
Yeah,
I think it might have been the
again, yeah,
Nidhogger brand, actually, if not another one, because I know there are lots of others. Because forget about mead, I know there's some like whiskies and scotches that have like a typical Viking-esque-ness applied to them, even though they're not a typical, well, yeah, stereotypes, typical stereotype. The words are too similar.
no, yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Viking
Well,
drink.
I mean, Highland Park whiskey
Mm.
decided a few years ago. I mean, whiskey has a particular sense of, like all Scotch whiskey is associated with a past, but it's associated with a sort of with Scotland, with the imagery surrounding whiskey marketing on the whole is heather, is isolated distilleries out in the middle of
Mm.
nowhere with Scottishness, and it's to a certain extent it's going to play on the sort of same sort of imagery you get with shortbread, or it's a sort
Mm.
of rural Scottish
Islands. That's what it always makes
Exactly,
me
and
think of.
all of that. But what Highland Park did was attempt to distinguish themselves and set themselves as separate from all of that by saying, right, we're in Orkney, we've got
Oh
a
yes.
particular identity, which is Highland Park Orkney or is it Shetland? I no, I think it's Orkney. We've got a localized sort of Scandinavian identity, which is and let's play on that. And in that way, we shift ourselves out from where we are just one amongst all these other hundreds of
Mm,
distilleries who are all competing to be more Scottish and more bagpipes and
mm,
more sort of
mm,
heather and all of sort of slightly grainy black and white photographs. Um, you're shifting yourself out from that and creating a distinction and a difference by the fact that you're going and making yourself Scandinavian instead and playing to a
mm,
whole set of associations which are different from all of your competitors. The interesting thing is that they shifted back, is that they've abandoned that set of marketing and they shifted back into just being Scottish. And
mm.
that's is a really interesting phenomenon. But so maybe it worked, maybe it didn't work. But it's yeah. That is a really sort of it's interesting for people trying to do that. I have seen some wine marketing itself with Vikings, but that's weird. That really
That is.
plays against all of because wine on the whole tends to want it to market itself as we're a bit sophisticated, we're drinking wine,
Mm,
we're not, we're sort of we're slightly middle class and slightly bougie, and we're sort of we're those are its associations, and it also frequently wants to market itself to women. That's
mm,
the more common association of wine. Whereas putting Viking branding on, which is all about
mm,
this sort of rather burly, masculine, slightly rough and ready, unsophisticated, it just doesn't chime with wine at all, or it doesn't chime with what wine normally tries to be. So it's interesting, and it's very. I mean, it's very uncommon, and I have seen it once, but it doesn't happen very.
yeah.
Um, but it's super interesting seeing the way that you use these visual identifiers, particularly because the Vikings have got such a wonderful set of visual identifiers. The sort of
Mm,
the ravens, the beards, the runic writing, the horned helmets, the
mm-hmm,
long ships, the stripy sail, all of the
hmm.
axes, all of that nonsense. Well, I call it nonsense, but you know what I mean. It's
It is. A lot of it is stereotype, and I think that's what I love diving into, especially
mm,
kind of like just with any Viking. As much as I love learning about the real history, I love to analyze why people are presenting them as they do. I mean that energy drink that I mentioned, as well as having a Viking warrior with kind of like a cross-strapped round shield, having an axe. He also had two swords on his back, a bit of overkill, I thought.
of course,
Typical horned helmet. And then on the opposite side of the can, you've got a barbarian woman. I'm going to call her barbarian because I can't really call her a Viking woman because the whole issue of Viking warrior women is still
yes,
debated.
indeed,
Still debated. I'm sitting on the fence on this one. Um, she had kind of like typical fur leathers, not obviously well armored at all as any
of course
kind of
not.
like medieval woman to this kind of level of PR, but she also had a wolf beside her looking a bit cross and grumpy. And I'm like, is that meant to attract the women in the audience? Because I'm not really feeling it. And plus, I kept thinking, like, why have they put the horned helmets and all the skulls on the floor? It just really confuses the scenery.
Yeah,
So the level of Viking as a brand, I think, certainly has helped, I guess, to a degree, Mead be slightly more popular than it was even back when it was historically drunk. Simply because we've got better access to resources like beekeepers, beekeeping farms. It's the modern society today is more able to make mead than
yeah.
the past was. Um, but I certainly hope to any viewers or viewers listening and watching, the next time you try to treat yourself to a bottle of mead, just think how lucky you were to have had this if you were in the Viking Age. But oh gosh, there's so much more we could talk about, but we are running out of time, I'm afraid, Simon. But thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today to talk about the myth and the magic that is Mead.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, Becky. It's really, really lovely, and I've thoroughly enjoyed talking about it. It's a great subject, and I do love just wittering on.
Oh, I could like literally, I learned lots from you, Spang, and I've learned lots all over again because it is a fascinating subject. I think some that don't really realise how much there is or there isn't true kind of thing, and I've loved lifting the lid on the meat barrel and seeing what's actually at the bottom. So thank you so much.
Thank you.